Good morning, and welcome back to the Carsey Policy Hour. I'm UC Terrell. The Carsey Policy Hour is the UNH Carsey School of Public Policy's monthly discussion series for policymakers, public service professionals, and active citizens and organizations on the issues and policies that affect the Granite State. As folks are entering, please type your name and affiliation into the chat. Our topic this month is tariffs and tourism. What's next in New Hampshire's trade with Canada? We've all been watching trade tensions unfold at a national level, from tariffs and retaliatory tariffs to talk of annexation, boycotts, and sovereignty, to the election of a new Prime Minister Carney and his meeting with President Trump just last week in the White House. Today, we will break down what this means for New Hampshire. First, Brian Gottlob will present the numbers, economic, labor market, and industry trends related to imports, exports, investment, and travel tourism between Canada and New Hampshire. Brian is the principal of PolEcon Research, an economic consulting firm located in Dover, and he sits on the advisory board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston's New England Public Policy Center. Brian is also the director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau, though he speaks to us today in personal capacity. Next, Tim Egan will present the organizational ecosystem, the state and regional entities, how they've worked to build productive relationships over the past years and weeks, and potential paths forward. Tim is a vice president for the New England Canada Business Council, or NECBC. He also served on the New Hampshire-Canadian Trade Council for 10 years and has represented Grafton District No. 2 in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. Together, Brian and Tim will set the stage for an engaging discussion that I hope everyone will participate in. Please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat as the presentations are underway so that we can position them for the discussion later. Some final housekeeping. If you haven't yet, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. In the spirit of an in-person discussion over morning coffee, the chat is open to all to contribute to and to see. We just ask that you identify yourself in each remark if your Zoom ID is unclear. The presentation and slides will be available online by the end of the week. Finally, we thank our series partners, as always, the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the New Hampshire Association of Counties, the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, or NEMS, and New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training with its Certified Public Manager program that feeds into Carsey's 4 master's programs. So, Brian and Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. I will turn it over to you, Brian, to kick us off.
Terrific. Thank you very much, UC. I will attempt to share my screen here. And let me know if you're all able to see it. That would be helpful. How are we doing? Able to see it? Good.
That looks great.
Terrific. I want to start out with just a couple of comments. Number one is that it's very difficult to talk about these issues without having some of the discussion ascribed to political or ideological thoughts. What I'm going to present today is strictly on the basis of economic analysis and data. There's no political or ideological intent in any of the words that I say, so I hope you don't take it that way. I'm not speaking for state government or the administration in any of my comments. These are simply the comments and the analysis that I've done as a private citizen. So with that rather long introduction, I have a lot of slides. I'll go through them quickly, probably too quickly, but as UC said, you will have a copy available. And I'm happy to answer questions after the presentation. My email is on the presentation. Feel free to contact me with questions after. This first quote here, I put it up largely because I think it speaks volumes to the relationship and where we are in the relationship. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney saying we're over the shock of the American betrayal. Betrayal is an awfully strong word. I have to tell you that I have some personal interest in this beyond my interest as an economist and a resident of New Hampshire. I am 50% Canadian component parts. Half of my DNA is Canadian. I grew up an hour south of Montreal. So I take the relationship and have been a part of the relationship for quite some time. So it is particularly disturbing for me to see how quickly the relationship has fallen. Just to give you an idea of how Canadians are looking at this, these are just some shots of what's happening in stores in Canada in terms of their really rousing of their patriotism. And I wonder if it's not more of a rally around Canadian products as it is a wish to boycott American products. As you see here, all of these tags, everything noting it's prepared in Canada. Some will have it made in Canada. And American companies, Heinz Ketchup there, putting a Canadian maple leaf on its label, indicating and trying to get ahead of some of this, and they've let people know that they buy tomatoes from Ontario, and that has so they're not truly just a fully American company. Looking at the relationship from an export-import perspective, Canada's largest trade is our largest trading partner in New Hampshire, almost $2 billion in 2024. Almost $1 billion more than our next closest trading partner, Japan. That relationship, however, has changed over the years. We, at one point, our trading partner, we imported $8 billion from Canada. So we're down to $2 billion now. So been a pretty significant reduction in how much we import. And really the key to that is petroleum products. Number one import from Canada, petroleum products, largely fuel oils, heating fuel, propane, and I'm assuming it could be at one time. New Hampshire did have power plants that were fueled by heat by oil. We may have at one point imported that as well. That probably contributed, since we don't do that any longer, to some of the decline. I also don't believe that we actually, as this chart shows, $7 billion in petroleum products. Well, I know enough about the fuel consumption in New Hampshire to know that there was at no point did New Hampshire actually consume $7 billion of fuel oil. And thus some of that may have just passed through New Hampshire on its way to other locations in the United States. In terms of exports, well, we say we almost import $2 billion from Canada. We export a little more than half of that. So we do have a trade deficit with Canada, and Canada occasionally is our largest export market. It has gone back and forth, but right now Germany is our largest trading partner, and that has to do with the fact that we have some fairly large German companies, manufacturers in this state, and we export products that they make to Europe and to Germany. The aerospace industry is really, from my perspective, on the front lines of this. Aerospace products are our largest export to the world, but they are also our largest export product to Canada. Canada has, in the Montreal area for a long time, had an aerospace cluster. Bombardier makes jets. They also make some in Toronto. New Hampshire, not as well known as some of other industries in the state, but has a really vibrant aerospace industry led by companies like General Electric, which makes jet engines. Those jet engines go into jets made by Bombardier. They also go into Boeing jets, and they go into jets that are made by Airbus. One of the concerns that I have beyond the issue with Canada is if there's retaliation from European countries. One of the areas that they've looked at retaliating tariffs is in the aerospace industry. That would have a fairly profound impact on New Hampshire and some key New Hampshire companies. GE not alone. Safran makes structural materials, composite materials that go into Airbus. It's a French-based company. We have a lot of instrument makers that go into different parts of the airplane. So it's a really important industry. Turbines, turbo fans are made in New Hampshire. So it's a critical industry that is really on the front lines of the tariff wars. I did want to highlight the fact that there are really pretty substantial sub-state, subnational impacts of the potential, well, the obvious breakdown of relations between Canada and the United States. In particular, looking at some of our New England neighbors. New Hampshire's, as I had indicated, our imports from Canada have been on the decline. So now they're about 19% of all of our imports. On the other hand, Maine has a much more substantial connection with its imports from Canada. Not only do they represent a much larger portion, now in 2024, 70% of imports into international imports into Maine come from Canada, and that's been on the rise. So in a lot of ways, while clearly there will be profound effects of the breakdown of trading relations and maybe beyond trading relations between the US and Canada, Maine is much more likely to be affected economically, I believe, than is New Hampshire. Although, again, the impacts in New Hampshire will clearly be substantial. And the same is true not only for imports, but exports. New Hampshire's exports been fairly consistent. About 16% of our exports go to Canada. Again, we do have a trade, so-called trade deficit. I don't see that particularly problematic with Canada. But Maine has a much more substantial portion of its economy, and a lot of that, not surprising, shellfish, lobsters, a big portion of the exports that go from Maine to Canada. And a lot of what Maine exports is that it exports lobsters internationally. Another way that the two countries, and New Hampshire and Canada, are connected is with foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is companies that are headquartered in the US or headquartered in Canada, making an investment in the other country. And as this chart shows, just looking at a 5-year period, most recent 5-year period that I could find data, more US companies invested in Canada than Canadian companies invested in the US. So the net difference between those investments made by US companies in Canada and Canadian companies made in the US is almost $150 million. Where do we get a lot of foreign direct investment from, or at least in this 5-year period? Switzerland and Germany, and I mentioned again, a lot of German companies, smaller manufacturers in particular, have located in New Hampshire. But there's still some very well-known companies that are Canadian companies that have, I think, are really significantly integrated into the New Hampshire economy. Certainly TD Bank, one of the largest by deposits and by branches banks in New Hampshire, very prominent in the banking industry. Liberty Utilities, which I myself didn't realize is a Canadian-owned company. Highliner Foods, frozen fish, Sprague Resources, and a lot of that has to do with those petroleum imports that I mentioned. But the list is fairly long. This is just a sampling of them, gives you some idea of the breadth of companies that are Canadian-owned in New Hampshire. I did want to mention what I think are maybe among the most significant impacts, and that's what's happening with Canadians' willingness to visit the United States. I mentioned that sense of betrayal that I showed you in the first chart, the rousing of the patriotism among Canadian citizens. One way that's being manifested is in a unwillingness of Canadians to do what they have traditionally done, which is visit the United States. I was at doing a presentation yesterday, and the host mentioned, as a resident of Hampton, he had heard anecdotally from a number of the rental properties there, hotels, smaller hotels, the volume of reservations that had been canceled by Canadian residents. Just taking a look at border crossing data from the Statistics of Canada. They do a wonderful job, by the way, documenting the border crossings. This happens to be just passenger vehicles, so it doesn't have anything to do with trucks or commerce. It's passenger vehicles. They can even tell us how many had overnight visits. It's just a really excellent data source. And what you see is a very troubling data pattern. If I took this back further, what you would see is that visits on comparing the same months of 2025 and 2024, you'd see that there had been a pretty consistent increase in 2024, late 2024 over 2023. When did that change? It changed even in January, there was a slight uptick, but it began to change in February, accelerated in March to the point where now it's over 40% drop in border crossings by passenger vehicles into the returning from the US to Canada. If that continues, that will have some really profound effects, I think, on our hospitality and tourism industry in New Hampshire. So I'm going to take a flyer here. I made an attempt to estimate the economic impacts, and there are just a tremendous number of potential impacts, but here's the 4 categories that I used to try and estimate and put a dollar figure on what potentially could happen. First, there's higher import prices, mostly input prices, goods and commodities that go into other final products. We don't do a lot of final consumer goods by Canada, but heating oil, propane, and fish are exceptions. The higher costs and lower demand for goods exported are exports. I mentioned the aerospace industry would be on the front lines of that, as well as a reduction in Canadian visitors in their spending. So when I take a look and tried to estimate, a whole lot of assumptions go into this. Number one assumption, I made an assumption, and this is probably unrealistic, that the tariffs would remain for a full year. I went through all of the products that we sell, discovered what the current tariff is on them, assumed that they'd be on for a whole year, and tried to come up with some other scenarios, a 5% decline in exports to Canada as a result of their reciprocal tariffs, 15% decline in Canadian visitors. That may be very optimistic based on more recent trends, and a $37 million cost to increase our fuel imports, largely heating oil. So if that occurred, we'd actually have about $400 million increase in tariffs. I assume that companies would work around a lot of that, and ultimately about a $200 million increase would affect businesses in New Hampshire. And that would result in over 1,100 fewer jobs. And when I have a negative sign here, it does not necessarily mean that there's people losing their jobs. It's just mean compared to the baseline forecast. If we were adding 8,000 jobs in 2026 or 2025, we would add only 7,000 jobs. In some cases, there may be layoffs. A 5% decline in exports to Canada would result in almost 500,000 fewer jobs from our baseline forecast. Canadian visitors, 363. And I do believe that this is an area where we could see actual reductions in employment, actual layoffs in employment. And the cost increase of fuel imports, 123. So a total impact, full year tariffs, full on, about 2,000 fewer, 2,100 fewer jobs than we would have had otherwise. And I will say that in my concluding thoughts, those negative impacts that I showed you, they, over time, and particularly if the tariffs are removed, those jobs would recover. We will get back to the baseline. We will certainly get back to the baseline. Over time, economic damage can be mitigated, it can be repaired, and it will take, by my estimates, 3 or 4 years before we got back to baseline. The damage to trust and mutual respect, from my perspective, I just find that more troubling. I think it's much more difficult to repair. When you hear words like betrayal, it becomes very difficult to repair those kinds of relationships. Not impossible, but again, I think the path to doing that is much less clear. And I can't speak to those actions. It's going to take leadership. It's going to take leaders of New England and a lot of institutions to work through that. I don't have the insights into that, but our next speaker, Tim Egan, can address some of those. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it over to him. And thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Boy, I've learned a lot just from hearing you speak, even though we've been talking about this presentation for a little bit. So, UC, thank you for having me today. Hi, good morning. So let me start with my personal connection. People might be wondering why a guy named Timothy Thaddeus Egan, an Irish-Italian kid from New Jersey, is involved in Canadian business. I married a woman from Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and as you know, Woonsocket is a large area of French-Canadian folks who have migrated, and her grandmother came from north of Montreal to work in the mills back in the 20s. And that's part of what I think is our issue here, you see, is this is a very emotional, familiar relationship that Canada and New England have, especially here in New Hampshire. So let me get my slides ready. And I think that's part of what I want to cover a little bit is sort of how did we get here? And can you see those okay?
Yes, similarly to Brian, perhaps go into presentation mode. You see the background to the slide.
How's that?
There we
Better?
go. Yes.
Wonderful. So good morning, everyone. My name is Timothy Egan. I'm currently a vice president with the New England Canada Business Council. I've been involved in that organization for probably about a dozen years. The vice president for about the last 4 or 5. As UC mentioned, I spent a long time working with the New Hampshire-Canada Trade Council, which is one of the few, if not the only, state-run trade group tied to Canada in New England. So we very much, our state has a very important relationship with Canada. Just recently, our organization held a national webinar based on the results of the Canadian Prime Minister election. And what we felt was really important is that there's this logic that while this issue is existing federally, there's going to have to be an area where we have to work together, state and province and province. Canadians are our friends, our neighbors, our family, and I mean that specifically. Acadians came down from New Brunswick and have settled in Woodstock area. I live in Sugar Hill. Many folks from Montreal came into Manchester, St. Anselm's and is a representation of that. And so our colleague that you're executive director of the Institute, Stephen Bird, and I know well, Monica Gattinger, talked about how that this relationship is going to be a subnational opportunity. There's going to be a need for our states to engage in the provincial offices. Just recently, Governor Healy in Massachusetts coordinated a letter in an effort to mitigate some of the stress that states are seeing from the concerns about trade and tourism reduction, inviting the premiers to come to New England. She gathered a variety of folks, a bipartisan group of folks, to come and engage in a discussion on how we can work together. I think that's what most people took out of Prime Minister Carney's visit to the White House with President Trump was, while there are these issues, we have to figure out how to work past them and work together. I think another important aspect is really to understand what is existing here that actually builds this relationship and has been building this relationship for years. The organization I represent was founded in 1981. We focus very much on trade and tourism, very much in specific industries like energy, finance, and technology. Canadian companies like TD Bank and Hydro-Quebec and its partnership with Eversource, Liberty, Irving Energy are all folks that are part of our membership and our engagement. Annually, we put on 2 events, an economic forum, which we just recently had the chief economist from TD Bank speak at the Federal Reserve to a group of about 100 business leaders about how she sees the economy being affected based on this tariff relationship. And as well, we have our for over 30 years, a energy conference, which is a senior leadership conference that takes place in the fall, where we really learn a lot about the business world, the ancillary businesses tied to energy production throughout New England, and how that is such a pivotal relationship between Canada and the US. If I remember it correctly, all of the fuel oil at Logan Airport comes from Canada. A majority of Quebec's power comes down through Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire into major metropolitan areas like Boston and Hartford and Providence. So this relationship is really key to a lot of our businesses, and our organization really tries to keep its finger on the pulse of what those issues are that help businesses move forward. Another group that we partner with is the Canadian Entrepreneurs in New England scene. They are basically Canadian expatriates in the greater Boston area focused on technology and biotechnology, trying to mentor businesses that grow. They bring Canadian businesses down into New England, figure out how to help them build and set up shop. So that's an existing relationship that we are going to need to do a good job of managing, making sure those businesses feel comfortable coming down here. I have to give a really good shout out to the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs, BEA, Commissioner Taylor Caswell, especially my friend, North Country Representative Bino LaMontagne, spend a lot of time thinking about the Canadian relationship within the agency. They are one of two groups, as well, the Secretary of State's office, who oversee the New Hampshire-Canada Trade Council. And it's important that state government really understands what's at play here and does their best to try and mature and guide this relationship. I had the pleasure of, in November, producing an economic trade forum for them at the Mount Washington Hotel with about 50, 60 business leaders from Sherbrooke and Montreal that came down. And it's important to sort of make sure that that reciprocal event that happens and has been happening for about 10 years. I think my first one was with Governor John Lynch. So that's how far back my relationship with that organization goes. But each year, business leaders come from New Hampshire into Canada or vice versa. And the Trade Council sort of creates that annual event to build upon the relationships that exist and to make sure that we're giving businesses guidance. And I can't not mention the Franco-American Center. Many of you know from the Poutine event that happens in Manchester every year, but that's a perfect example of how Canadian culture is so integrated into the relationship that New Hampshire has with our residents and our consumers. And so that, cultural heritage is a really important part of being respected. And I think that's a little bit what Brian's numbers were showing, is that Canadians don't necessarily feel respected. A few examples of how we've seen that be manifested is in the first Trump term, small businesses were starting to be hurt by a series of tariff efforts by the president on steel and aluminum, to the point where that became apparent not only in the aerospace industry that Brian mentioned, but also in the craft brewing industry, which is really strong in northern or in most of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Right? Think about where you go and enjoy your afternoon beverage. A lot of craft brewing is all that packaging was coming from Canada. And so this aluminum concern raised our board's interest to the point where actually we put together a letter to the governors to say, we need you to do something here where you're going to hurt your own state's economies. And to their credit, Governor Scott, Governor Mills, and Governor Sununu put together a bipartisan letter, as you see here, to strongly encourage the removal of any proposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum products in order for both sides to focus and collaborate on recovery areas. Remember, this is right after COVID. So, this was a concern, in trying to open the doors of tourism and making sure that businesses that had been shuttered were also going to be able to provide products at a cost-effective price for their customers. That's an important aspect when you realize that not just New England, but 32 states count Canada as their #1 trading partner. We really got a good understanding of the Canadian relationship when we put together a series on the USMCA, which was the renegotiation of NAFTA, with then Representative Welch in Vermont, with then Congressman Custer in New Hampshire, and with and then in Maine with Senator King. We talked about what would, how is, and the result of NAFTA's renegotiation in the USMCA, how will that affect our New England businesses? And so, we really got an ability to understand what small businesses and medium-sized businesses were thinking about this. So that's been something that's in our mindset as we move forward in looking at these tariffs, because it really sort of changes that agreement. Remember, this agreement was signed by President Trump. He renegotiated NAFTA. So for him to then add a tariff plan in the recent months on top of an agreement he had already set in place, he was sort of changing the rules of his own game that he had set up. So it's concerning to us on the board of what will happen next, because we thought there was a sort of a set playing field. The other concern that I think people will see and are seeing in New Hampshire and in other New England states is really that when it comes down to this, it's a matter of policy issues. While the politics exist and there are, two sides to every issue, and there are two parties that discuss this issue in the United States, and actually, we saw the parties' mindset change in the prime minister's election, where the Liberals and the Conservatives turned out in record numbers at the detriment to the Parti Québécois and the New Democratic Party. At the end of the day, it comes down to costs for operating your business or operating your home. With tariffs, we're going to see steel and aluminum costs go up for small businesses in New Hampshire. That's going to harm, as I mentioned before, Canadian aluminum for businesses in the craft brewing world. It's going to affect the aerospace industry. I think really one of the things that people will understand when I say it out loud is remember how softwoods are created. New Hampshire, the second most logged state in the nation after Maine, are sending our logging, because we don't have mills here anymore, across the border to mills. That milled wood is then returned as softwood. So not only do northern New England states have housing issues now, but to raise the price of softwoods and at a time when we're having a housing crunch is also going to be something that's very detrimental. And the last one that I think we're seeing, the president of the New England Farmers Union is a New Hampshire farmer, and he referenced that most of the farmers in northern New England get their fertilizer from across the border because it's cheaper and easier to ship. And so fertilizer costs will go up, which will make food products go up. And whether that is vegetables that you buy at your grocery store or food that you get within your at your restaurant. So we have to understand at the end of the day, this is a fiscal issue. And if people were talking about how the past US election was driven by fiscal issues, we have to be respectful that, we can't make them worse for people in the eyes of a protectionist mindset, which politically I'm not in favor of. I'm a global free market economist. I think the last one that we're beginning to see now is right here in the North Country. We're beginning to hear and see from organizations that are concerned. Every year, one of the major revenue generators for the state of New Hampshire is New Hampshire Liquor Commission. I think as these numbers are 2023, $165 million in net profit. That's in jeopardy. About 4 or 5 years ago, the state was able to adjust the amount of liquor that Canadians could buy to return across the border. We actually increased the amount. So we were on this upward swing of Canadians coming here, enjoying the benefits of tax-free New Hampshire and buying liquor and taking it home. And so is that at risk? Is our number one generator of revenue from a state agency going to begin to see a loss? Tourism is our number two industry in the state. And so when we begin to hear from the Hampton Chamber and White Mountain Attractions, who recently were part of a program, I have to give a shout out to Fred Coker from WMUR, who's been doing a tremendous job reporting on the business impact of this, that 36% of Canadians are canceling trips. This goes back to that emotional aspect that I mentioned at the top of my talk, was that, this is very personal for people. And so when you feel maligned, what do? You say, well, if my neighbor's treating me wrong, I'm not going over for dinner. And the last one that has actually been on a growth sector, life sciences here in New Hampshire, whether it's Dean Kamen's Army or the efforts of the New Hampshire Life Sciences and Andrea Echeverry to grow the industry here. They look at the University of Sherbrooke with their great medical and healthcare programs and try to figure out how to get recruit from that area for folks to come here and work in our industry. But if the research is showing that Canadians are 59% less likely to want to visit New Hampshire, who's going to come for a tour of the area to say, hey, do I want to take a job here? Do I want to set up shop here? So this is a concern that we have. We have this, the graphic here is, that there are a lot of reasons why New Hampshire is a place for people to come visit from Canada. We have to figure out how we mature that conversation to make sure that we're making them comfortable.
Tim, okay, there you go.
Right. So we're doing that a little bit. I have to give some credit to Governor Ayotte. She's in a very difficult position. And this is where Brian said he can't talk about politics. I can. She's a Republican governor who's very close with President Trump. So she has to be mindful of his interest sometime to take things personally. And so if she says something that he doesn't feel is comfortable, do we end up seeing, money not go to fish and game through the park, National Park Service, or do we see, money get cut for Medicare, Medicaid? So she has made some statements about that, Canada is a strong trading partner, and that it's important that, she respects what he's trying to do to reduce fentanyl. We all are, and make sure the border is secure. But we can't do that at the risk of frustrating our friends, neighbors, and partners in business. Her more recent comment, again, someone else who's doing a really good job, Jack Heath, of discussing this issue on the Pulse of New Hampshire. She talked about, that here's these tariff issues are going to affect us, and she's hopeful that we can try and figure out how to resolve them. What that means is we have to be open, we have to be engaging. And if you noticed from before, with the letter that went out from all the governors, she was not listed on there. My hope is that there are conversations to have the governor be involved in any of the conversations with the premiers. There is an annual New England Governors Eastern Canadian Premiers event that does take place that I know her economic development folks are focused on. So there's a balancing act definitely that has to be had. And so moving forward, there has to be this increased level. If it's not governor to premier, is it director to director? There are a variety of organizations that exist in Canada that business leaders can engage, and that business trade organizations can engage, whether it's Invest in Quebec or Opportunities in Brunswick or Invest in Nova Scotia. They've all taken part in different events that our organization, that the Business Council, has put on. But we ask folks to figure out and think about how can they, as a business leader, encourage their government officials to be more engaging of their Canadian partners, whether that's calling your state senator or state representative, or partnering with your economic development office or your chamber to be more engaging. And that level of communication has to take place. It has to be the BIA, the Business and Industry Association in New Hampshire, talking with the greater Sherbrooke Chamber. Those things are where the rubber meets the road of business leaders trying to do day-to-day work. And maybe that's what pushes us past the federal rhetoric that takes place. So, if folks are interested, there's a bunch of opportunities that we present around our focus on energy investment and understanding of the Canadian US relationship. We represent the 6 New England states and the 6 Eastern Canadian provinces. And so I ask folks, I'm glad to answer any questions, but if you do want to know more, please reach out to us at the Business Council. Our mission is to try and facilitate this ongoing relationship. I ask folks to remember the longest in history, longest in length, non-militarized border exists between the US and Canada, and it's a relationship that we have to hold dearly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Brian, why don't you come back on camera? Tim, you can stop screen sharing. And fantastic presentation, both from the quantitative economic fiscal labor side of things and talking about the organizational ecosystem, especially at this sub-national level, which we're seeing may have the most promise in the weeks ahead, at least, and even possibly for those long-term relationships and that trust and cultural connection that we've held for so many years. We've had a great audience as usual. Interestingly, we have a number of banks on the call today, and it's interesting to see in the chat some of the comments about the borrowers, particularly in travel and tourism. Again, connected to what you were saying, Brian, perhaps the impact even in travel and tourism will be felt more in Maine. We'll see about that. And the general drop, you both shared declines in what we've seen and what's been forecast. I've seen even national numbers of Canadian travel to the US declining sharply, with flight bookings dropping by 75% compared to the previous year. So we're fortunate that we can have visitors driving across the 58-mile border, but we're seeing it in different ways as well. We only have one question currently, and that's about, okay, great, about ICE. And so what we are seeing, if anything, connected to those particular ICE activities, perhaps distinguished from the larger commentary and approach and cultural reactions. So if we would distinguish between those two.
Oh, that's a big one. And I think, Brian, you probably can't touch ICE conversations, yes?
I'm not reluctant to. I just don't have any particular insights that are worthy of commenting. I try not to speak on issues that I don't have any direct knowledge of, and that just happens to be when I don't.
You see, what I can say about it, I'm not involved in those federal discussions, but what I can tell you is recent conversations that I had with a variety of federal governmental leaders is the reaction that hotelers and hospitality folks are getting, and Canadians are responding about not just wanting to come here, but fearing coming here. And so are they going to bring a colleague or a friend that may not have accurate documentation that is a Canadian dual citizen with another country, and then they come here and they have some type of problem because there is this, overarching look at every document with a fine microscope of, who are you a citizen of? And so that's where this issue is actually going to come back to hurt us on tourism. Is not only are people going to feel frustrated by the angry neighbor that they don't want to visit, but then is the angry neighbor going to want their papers every time they come to the door? And so I think that's where this, as your the question you're asked, the ICE situation, that's where it will become actually more of a tourism problem. The other place where it might affect itself, a few of the board members at the Business Council are very much involved in working on documentation to allow Canadian workers to work in the United States. And so if there's more scrutiny and it takes more time, does a Canadian business say, well, this is going to be frustrating, I'm not going to set up shop there? That's where, New Hampshire, along with Maine and Vermont, are going to hurt, because the proximity to Quebec City or Montreal or Sherbrooke is important, when the home office can be, a half hour or 2 hour car ride away. Where they look to set up shop can be impacted by this type of immigration documentation situation, is a polite way to put it.
I want to give a shout out to UNH's Recreation Management and Policy Department. Jason Seaman, Brian, was the one who connected me first to you. And for folks on the call in particular, Brian has regular updates on his LinkedIn page as a private citizen, not as a state employee, that is quite insightful and data-driven as he's presented on today's call. So I direct folks to continue following his work, as well as the work of the New England Canada Business Council. We have a great question. Brian and Tim, what are your recommendations for our governor for immediate steps to enhance relations between New Hampshire and Canada?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There aren't a lot of positives about tariffs, in my view. I'm on record as saying I don't like tariffs. I thought there was one thing that maybe New Hampshire could benefit from, is that, and folks at BEA make a strong effort in order to get Canadian investment in New Hampshire by firms. I think that's particularly difficult now for Canadian firms, given that kind of call to patriotism. To be investing in New Hampshire is very difficult. So I really think we have to redouble those efforts. That if there is a benefit, one of the benefits could be, because of these tariffs, maybe it makes sense to locate some of your operations in New Hampshire. I think we at the highest levels in New Hampshire, and I am not at the highest levels by any means, need to make sure that we are welcoming. We welcome Canadian companies to invest in New Hampshire, not to acquire Canadian companies, but the message has to be very clear. We respect your sovereignty. We respect you as individuals. We're not looking to acquire anything, but New Hampshire is a great place to do business, and we have to have that message very, very, very clearly. I know in Vermont, this is interesting. I think their tourism office is actually sending individual cards or acknowledging people who have in some way connected with the Vermont Tourism Office, to let them know, we welcome you. You are our friends. So any of those kind of entrees, I think, are very helpful. And I do say, I think our executives and our administration needs to be very clear to the Canadian provinces and to their officials that we want to maintain that relationship. That it's absolutely too critical. So whatever is happening at the national level, I think we have to go our own way and make it clear that this is not how necessarily we treat our neighbors. It's one thing to be a senator from Alabama and not have to worry about how many Canadian visitors you have. It's another thing to be on the northern border, and so we have to be free to set our own path.
Yeah, you see, I think there's a couple things that we can do, and I think Brian's right in terms of looking at sort of maybe, well, I'll call it investment. Already the state spends about $1 million a year marketing New Hampshire in Montreal. Could we do more of that? Vermont actually has a trade office in Montreal. Maine has the International Trade Office, which does repeated FAM trips or business trips to Canada. Could we do more? What that would take is my former colleagues in the House and the Senate to shave a couple pennies here and there out of wherever we can find them and allow the Office of Economic Development to create more marketing and outreach and say in that messaging, we are open for business. Early on in my involvement with former Secretary of State Gardner on the New Hampshire-Canada Trade Council, we actually created a Bienvenue campaign. What this came out of was some unfortunate incidents that happened in Montreal because Canadians tip more like Europeans. They tip on the service, not as part of the U.S. mentality, which is you get a small wage and higher tips. And people were disparaging Canadians for not tipping well. So we wanted to make sure that we were telling people New Hampshire was open for business, and this Bienvenue campaign, which the New Hampshire-Canada Trade Council and Plymouth State and really worked on to try and promote that. There could be more of that. I think, I'm going to go way out on a limb, but that's me, and people know me. Should the governors invite folks to visit New Hampshire? Should she say, I'm going to join this event that the other governors are putting together? Should she make sure that the state is going to participate in the New England Governors Eastern Canadian Premiers Annual Conference? Make some statements that say, at the end of the day, if New Hampshire is about business and we have a great business climate, right? No sales tax, no income tax, a variety of incentives for businesses that the BEA does a great job of explaining. But if she can echo those comments and say, we have to respect our border. It is a relationship that is important to us. Maybe the last thing that could be done is thinking about how different organizations could be tapped to support this effort, whether that's state agencies or whether that's educational institutions that have connections to Canada, and create some type of summit or discussion. So it shows the Canadians that we are interested in their issues. We are trying to figure out how to engage them. We understand federally there's this viewpoint. I think that's potential opportunities there.
Thank you both. It is heartening to know that the governor may be having conversations about partnering with the other New England governors. I know that Governor Sununu was able to attend those governor premier annual meetings in the past, and to approach the administration in a bipartisan way. So we'll look to see that. Thank you for that question and for the work that the BEA is doing. Amanda Goki from the Boston Globe. I think Brian and Tim have answered the question about Governor Ayotte's messaging, but please do feel free to follow up with each of them after this call if you'd like something more specific. We have a question that's pretty specific and perhaps could be answered in the chat by Brian or Tim if you know about the impact of tariffs on the export of biosolids. Again, James, that might be a follow-up question from their emails. I'm curious about, you both talked about advertising, promoting that New Hampshire is open for business. And in a way, it's trying to have the drag of some of the nationalist rhetoric and the betrayal overcome, like less drag and more ability for business people to take advantage of those economic incentives to come here. I'm curious about the impact of uncertainty in this. So, we saw just recently China's tariffs were dramatically cut. They may be increased again. The windows of decision making seem very hard to predict. And so is there a way that the state or region can make these incentives and messaging more stable, secure, predictable, even as federal changes may not be?
Mhm.
Boy, I don't know how when, New Hampshire didn't talk or enact policies to get us into this situation. And we have very few levers in order to reduce that uncertainty. That uncertainty is going to remain. I think, if there's, chaos in policymaking just seems to be, the way it's going to be for some time. That uncertainty is having tremendous, the damage is already done from this tariff talk because it has put on hold so many investment decisions. It has put on probably hiring decisions. So the damage has been done because of the uncertainty. When you create that much uncertainty, and we see this in financial markets, well, tariffs are going to be lowered. Well, temporarily they're lowered, but there's the prospect that very soon they could be reversed again. So there is, in an effort, I think, to reduce some uncertainty, just basically creating more uncertainty because there's nothing that is consistent, nothing that we can count on. I'm not sure there's anything that, as a state, we can do to reduce that uncertainty.
Yeah, it is very hard. The idea that this roller coaster is what we're on at the president's whim, and I'm sorry if people don't like that, but that's what it feels like. It feels like it's a whim. Like one day he feels this way, and we're going to enact these policies, and the next day he wakes up and he didn't have his coffee, and he's going to enact those policies. At the end of the day, the people who are going to bear the brunt of that are business leaders and consumers. It's really interesting to see the sort of the response. Governor Scott is sort of quiet in Vermont. He doesn't seem to be pushing back against the president, yet he's letting his state agencies, the attorney general has filed a few, joined a few suits against the federal government in some of these executive orders. I don't think I need to tell people Governor Mills has taken the complete opposite point of view. She is very outspoken about what is right and wrong about these policies for the state of Maine. I think that puts Governor Egan in a tough spot. If she can engage her legislature to be more oriented in thinking about what types of policies could get put in place that could help our state mitigate this. This harkens back to a previous session. There was actually a bill passed that Governor Sununu signed, which does not allow for any state project to use anything but U.S. steel. That didn't sit well with the Canadian Consul General, who called me directly to ask about it at that time, the former Consul General. So thinking about what are legislative efforts that we could do to show sort of a foundation of that if these policies are going to change federally, how can manage them locally? Again, it's back to that initial comment, right? At the sub-national level, what can we do on the ground? But New Hampshire is very unique, where we have a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, and 4 Democratic federal officials. So we straddle this interesting, political line in life. It's why all the presidential candidates come to New Hampshire, right, to see where the realist independent mindset is. If we can figure out ways to latch on to things that allow us to manage that roller coaster from policies, that might be a way to safeguard us. Otherwise, it's going to be, as referenced, Betty Davis, it is going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to, it's another 3.5 years of this roller coaster, and we have to be careful how to manage it.
Thank you, Brian and Tim. We have a question on the long-term changes in response to the tariffs. I'm looking at the time, and Brian, you've mentioned that you think in some ways this will even out. Of course, in our planning conversations, even if we eventually reach a new equilibrium, they're the individual staff and employees and business owners that will be bumped along the way, possibly. So just to recognize that.
Yeah, it's difficult because in the aggregate, it will take a few years for the equilibrium to be reached, but that does not mean everybody is made whole. And particularly small businesses will be negatively affected.
Right. Well, Brian Gottlob from PolEcon, Tim Egan from the New England Canada Business Council, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to your continued analysis, problem solving in the months ahead. Look at the NECBC website for events. Look at Brian's LinkedIn page for additional analyses. And my takeaway here is at the subnational level, we do what we can to redouble efforts to really cherish this long-term financial, cultural, geographic relationship.
UC, it was really a pleasure, and I really love the fact that the Carsey School is keeping on top of this issue. It is a major issue for our state, and I appreciate your time and attention to it. And Brian, it was a pleasure working with you on this.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I hope folks got something out of it.
They did, I'm sure. The slides and presentation will be up by the end of this week. Carsey Policy Hours are the second Wednesday of each month at 8 in the morning. This is for the academic year, so September through June. This means that next month's session on June 11th will be our final of the year. The topic is decarbonization from the ground up. Kind of a pun because it's the story of a unique collaboration between climate activists and Eversource, which resulted in the first geothermal system, decarbonization from the ground up, ever built by a gas utility. And this is a replicable partnership model nationally, and we're seeing additional progress after this initial pilot project in Framingham, Mass. Join us next month and hold on to the roller coaster. We'll make it through.